The landing craft touched down on the red soil with a soft hiss of hydraulics, and Dr. Laura Bennett was the third person to step onto the surface of Kepler 442b. She had dreamed of this moment for 15 years, but now that it was here, she felt a strange calm settle over her shoulders, like a familiar coat. The air smelled different through her helmet's filters, something like copper mixed with morning rain, and the two suns hung in the purple sky like mismatched eyes watching their arrival. Behind her, the rest of the expedition team was unloading equipment and setting up the initial survey markers while Commander Vincent Shaw barked orders in his usual efficient manner. Laura's job was clear from the beginning. She was the xenobiologist and medical officer for this 12-person team, and her primary responsibility was to study any life forms they encountered while keeping the team healthy in this alien environment. Shaw had made the rules very clear during their 3-month journey from Earth, and he repeated them again during the descent briefing. No direct interference with the native population. Minimal contact unless absolutely necessary. Observe and document from a safe distance, and under no circumstances were they to disrupt the natural development of the indigenous species. The Kalari were what the translation computers called them after analyzing their radio broadcasts. A humanoid species with bronze-colored skin and unusually long limbs that gave them a graceful appearance when they moved. The expedition had chosen this landing site carefully after months of orbital observation. They were on a hillside about 2 kilometers from the main native settlement, far enough to avoid causing alarm but close enough to conduct proper research. Through her visor, Laura could see the settlement spread out in the valley below, a collection of structures that looked almost organic, as if they had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from what might have been cooking fires, and small figures moved between the buildings going about their daily tasks. She felt a thrill run through her at the thought that she was looking at an alien civilization, something humanity had dreamed about for centuries and searched for across countless star systems. The first 2 days passed in a blur of activity. The team erected their prefabricated research outpost, a series of connected modules that would serve as their home for the next 6 months. They set up observation equipment, deployed atmospheric monitors, and began the careful work of cataloging the local ecosystem. Laura spent most of her time in the medical bay organizing supplies and studying the preliminary biological scans of the Kalari that the orbital satellites had captured. They were remarkably similar to humans in basic structure, with the same bilateral symmetry and general organ arrangement, though there were fascinating differences in their circulatory system and what appeared to be light-sensitive organs beneath their skin. The third day, Laura volunteered for solo survey, duty in the forest that bordered their outpost. Shaw approved her request, though he reminded her to maintain constant communication and to retreat immediately if she encountered any natives. She promised to follow protocols and set out with her field kit and scanner just after the larger sun had cleared the horizon. The forest was unlike anything on Earth, with trees that had crystalline bark and leaves that seemed to hum with a faint vibration when the wind touched them. Strange creatures moved in the canopy above her, 6-legged things that might have been the local equivalent of squirrels, and the ground was covered in a moss that felt springy beneath her boots. She had been walking for about an hour, carefully documenting plant specimens and taking soil samples, when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a whimpering noise, high and distressed, coming from somewhere ahead and to her left. Laura's first instinct was to activate her communicator and report to Shaw, but something in that sound spoke to the part of her that had spent 10 years working in emergency rooms before joining the space program. That was the sound of pain and fear, and it was coming from something small. She moved forward carefully, keeping her steps quiet, and pushed through a curtain of hanging vines that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. On the other side, she found a small clearing, and in the center of it was a child. The young Kalari was sitting with their back against a tree trunk, and even from a distance Laura could see the dark blue blood that stained the moss around them. The child's leg was badly injured with a deep gash that ran from knee to ankle, and their breathing was rapid and shallow, in a way that suggested shock or the early stages of systemic infection. Laura stood perfectly still for a moment as her training warred with her instincts. Every rule of first contact protocol said she should back away slowly, report this to Shaw, and let the command team decide how to handle the situation. The natives had their own medicine, and their own ways of caring for their injured, and human interference could cause diplomatic incidents or worse. But she was also a doctor, and she had taken an oath long before she ever dreamed of traveling to other worlds. That oath said she would help those in need regardless of who or what they were. The child's eyes fluttered open and focused on her with difficulty. They were large eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and in them Laura saw pure terror. The child tried to scramble backward, but the movement caused fresh blood to pulse from the wound, and they cried out in pain before slumping against the tree again. Laura made her decision in that instant, and she would spend the rest of her life grateful that she had. She knelt slowly and held up her hands in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. Her translator unit was already working to analyze the child's frightened babbling, but she did not need words to understand fear. She spoke softly, though she knew the child could not understand her language yet. She told them she was a doctor, and she wanted to help, and she would not hurt them, whether it was her tone or simply the child's weakness that made them stop struggling. Laura did not know, but they watched her with those luminous eyes as she opened her medical kit and began to work. The wound was deep and infected with some kind of native bacteria that her scanner identified as potentially lethal if left untreated. Laura cleaned it carefully with antiseptic solution, while the child bit down on a piece of fabric to muffle their cries of pain. She applied broad-spectrum antibiotics that should work across most carbon-based life forms, and then used a dermal regenerator to begin sealing the injury. The whole process took about 20 minutes, and by the end the child's breathing had steadied and some color had returned to their bronze skin. Laura wrapped the leg in adaptive bandaging that would adjust to the child's physiology and monitor the healing process. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and studied the child more carefully. They appeared to be about 8 years old in human terms, with the same gangly awkwardness of children everywhere, who were growing too fast for their coordination to keep up. The child stared back at her with curiosity now replacing the fear in their eyes. Laura offered a ration bar from her pack and a bottle of water. The child took them hesitantly, sniffed the bar carefully, and then began to eat with the desperate hunger of someone who had not had food in quite some time. Laura helped them to their feet and pointed toward the direction of the settlement. She made walking motions and pointed again, trying to ask if they could make it home. The child tested their weight on the injured leg, and their eyes widened with surprise at the lack of pain. They looked at Laura for a long moment and then did something that made her heart clench. The child reached up and touched their forehead with one hand and then extended that hand toward Laura, palm up. Even without the translator, Laura understood it was a gesture of gratitude. Then the child turned and began to walk through the forest, moving much more easily than before, though still with a slight limp. Laura watched the child disappear into the forest, and only then did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. Her hands were shaking slightly as she packed up her medical kit, and she noticed that her biometric monitor was showing elevated heart rate and adrenaline levels. Shaw would have access to that data, and he would know something significant had happened during her survey. There was no point in trying to hide it or delay the inevitable conversation, so she activated her communicator and began the walk back to the outpost. The forest seemed different now, more alive somehow, and she found herself looking at the trees and plants with new appreciation. This was not just an alien world to be studied and cataloged, but a home to real people who felt pain and fear and gratitude just as humans did. The walk back took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it rehearsing what she would say to Shaw. She could try to justify her actions by citing medical ethics or humanitarian principles, but she knew those arguments would ring hollow against the hard reality of first contact protocols. Those protocols existed for good reasons, and they were written by people who had studied hundreds of years of human history and all the mistakes that came from cultural interference and well-meaning intervention. But she also knew that she would make the same choice again if faced with an injured child, regardless of what species they belonged to. Shaw was waiting for her in the common area when she entered the outpost. He was standing by the observation window with his arms crossed, and his expression was the carefully neutral one he used when he was very angry, but trying to maintain professional composure. Lieutenant Paul Crawford was there too, the team's security officer, and his presence suggested this was going to be an official inquiry rather than a casual conversation. Laura set down her equipment case and faced them both with her chin up and her shoulders back. Shaw spoke first, and his voice was quiet but hard. He asked her what had happened out there and why her biometric data had spiked during her survey. Laura met his gaze and told him the truth without embellishment or excuse. She said she had encountered an injured native child in the forest, and that the child would have died without immediate medical intervention. She said she provided first aid and basic treatment, and then sent the child back toward their settlement. Shaw listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he asked her if she understood what she might have done, and Laura said she did. He asked if she realized that she had violated direct orders and compromised the entire mission, and she said yes. He asked if she had considered the potential consequences of interfering with an alien culture whose customs and taboos they knew nothing about, and she said she had, but that she could not let a child die when she had the means to save them. Shaw's jaw tightened, and he turned away to look out at the settlement. In the valley below, Crawford spoke up then, and his tone was more sympathetic than Shaw's. He said that he understood her instincts and that any decent person would want to help an injured child, but that first contact situations were incredibly delicate. He reminded her that there were documented cases of peaceful alien species who considered medical intervention to be a form of violation or contamination. Some cultures believed that injury and death were sacred processes that should not be interrupted by outsiders. Others had complex social structures where helping someone without permission from their family or clan could create obligations or debts that might be impossible to fulfill. Laura listened, and she acknowledged that she had thought about these possibilities, but in the moment when she saw that bleeding, frightened child, her training as a doctor had overridden her training as an explorer. Shaw turned back to face her, and he looked tired. He said that he was confining her to the outpost until they could assess the situation and determine whether her actions had caused any diplomatic damage. He said that if the natives reacted badly to what she had done, it could end the entire mission and force them to evacuate before completing their research. He said that while he understood her motivations, he could not condone what she had done, and there would be an official reprimand in her file. Laura accepted the restrictions and the punishment without argument. Shaw dismissed Crawford and then sat down heavily in one of the observation chairs. For a moment he was silent, and then he spoke more quietly. He told Laura that he had daughters back on Earth, 2 girls who were probably about the same age as the native child she had helped. He said that he hoped if his daughters were ever hurt and alone that someone would help them, regardless of rules or protocols. But he also said that he had a responsibility to the entire team, and to the broader goals of peaceful contact with alien civilizations. He said that sometimes the right thing to do as a person conflicted with the right thing to do as a mission commander, and that he hated being put in that position. Laura thanked him for his honesty and returned to her quarters to wait. That night she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling while the outpost systems hummed around her. Sleep would not come because her mind kept replaying the encounter with the child and imagining all the ways it could go wrong. She thought about the child's family and how they might react to their offspring returning with wounds healed by alien technology. Would they be grateful or terrified? Would they think their child had been cursed or contaminated? Would they blame the child for being in the wrong place at the wrong time? The anthropological databases were full of cautionary tales about first contacts that had gone catastrophically wrong because of simple misunderstandings or cultural differences that seemed minor but turned out to be fundamental. She finally drifted into an uneasy sleep sometime after midnight and dreamed of children running through crystalline forests while bronze-skinned warriors watched from the shadows. When her communicator chirped an urgent alert just after dawn, she woke with her heart already racing. It was Crawford's voice, tense and urgent, telling her to get to the observation deck immediately. She threw on her uniform and ran through the corridors, wondering what disaster she had caused. The observation deck was crowded with most of the team already gathered at the windows. Shaw was there with a pair of high-powered binoculars and his face was pale. Crawford stood by the security console with his hand near the weapons locker. Dr. Peter Hughes, their cultural specialist, was frantically scrolling through data on his tablet. Laura pushed through to the window and looked down at the valley below. What she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Arranged in precise military formation below their outpost were 40 Kalari warriors. They were tall and imposing, easily 2 meters in height, and they carried long spears with crystalline tips that caught the morning light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. They wore what appeared to be ceremonial armor, made from some kind of dark leather decorated with metal studs, and their faces were painted with intricate patterns in red and white. At the center of the formation stood an older warrior who was clearly their leader. His armor was more elaborate than the others, and he wore a cape made from some kind of fur that rippled in the morning breeze. And standing beside that older warrior, holding his hand and looking up at the outpost with those luminous eyes, was the child Laura had helped the day before. The child was no longer limping, and they wore clean clothes instead of the torn and bloodied garments from yesterday. They said something to the older warrior and pointed directly at the observation deck as if they could see through the reinforced glass and identify exactly where Laura was. Standing, Shaw lowered his binoculars and his voice was rough when he spoke. He said that the warriors had arrived just before dawn, moving in complete silence, and had assembled in that formation without making any demands or attempts to communicate. Crawford reported that the warriors had not made any aggressive moves, but that 40 armed natives represented a significant threat to their small research team. Hughes was still scrolling through his cultural database trying to find any precedent for this kind of gathering. He said that in many warrior cultures, a formal assembly like this could mean anything from a declaration of war to a ceremonial greeting, and without more context, they were flying blind. Laura stepped forward, and her voice was steadier than she felt. She said that this was because of what she had done, and that whatever the warriors wanted, it was about her. She said she should be the one to go down there and face whatever consequences her actions had created. Shaw immediately said no, and that they did not know the natives' intentions yet. But even as he spoke, the older warrior raised his spear high in the air and struck the butt of it against the ground 3 times. The sharp crack echoed across the valley like thunder, and every person in the observation deck flinched at the sound. Then something happened that no one expected. The older warrior knelt down on one knee and bowed his head. One by one, the other 39 warriors followed his example until all 40 of them were kneeling in the red dirt, with their spears held vertically before them. The child stepped forward from the group and looked up at the outpost, and even from this distance Laura could see that they were smiling. The hours between the morning encounter and the evening feast passed in a blur of activity and nervous energy. Shaw called an emergency meeting of the entire research team to brief them on what had happened, and to establish protocols for the upcoming cultural exchange. He made it clear that this was an unprecedented opportunity, but also a situation that required extreme care and attention to cultural sensitivities. Hughes spent the time reviewing everything they knew about Kalari social structures and customs, which was frustratingly little since most of their knowledge came from distant observation. Crawford ran security scenarios and established emergency extraction procedures in case something went wrong, though he admitted that if the Kalari decided to turn hostile, there was little they could realistically do to resist. Laura spent most of the afternoon in her quarters trying to process what had happened. She kept replaying the moment when Kalen and his warriors had knelt in the dirt, and she still could not quite believe that her simple act of helping an injured child had led to this. She thought about all the training she had received about first contact protocols and how none of it had prepared her for the reality of looking into a frightened child's eyes and making a split-second decision. She wondered what would have happened if she had followed the rules and walked away from Niara. The child would have died alone in the forest, and perhaps the Kalari would never have known that humans were nearby. Or perhaps they would have found Niara's body and blamed the Sky People for her death. There was no way to know, and she decided that second-guessing herself was pointless. When the suns began their descent toward the horizon, 4 Kalari warriors arrived at the outpost to serve as escorts. They were young by the standards of their species, probably equivalent to humans in their early 20s, and they seemed excited about the opportunity to interact with aliens. Shaw decided to keep the human delegation small for this first feast, so it would be himself, Laura, Hughes, Crawford, and Helen Wright, who was the team's pilot, and had expressed interest in learning about Kalari technology. The 5 humans followed their escorts down the hillside and across the valley toward the settlement. As they got closer, Laura could see that the Kalari settlement was far more sophisticated than their preliminary observations had suggested. The structures that had looked organic from a distance were actually grown from some kind of engineered plant matter, with walls that were alive and covered in bioluminescent patterns. The buildings varied in size from small dwellings to large communal structures, and they were arranged in a pattern that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land rather than imposing a rigid grid. The central plaza was surrounded by graceful spires that reached toward the sky and appeared to serve multiple purposes, including collecting moisture from the air and channeling sunlight into the buildings below. The plaza itself was already crowded with Kalari of all ages who had gathered to see the sky visitors. They maintained a respectful distance, but their curiosity was obvious in their luminous eyes and the way they craned their necks to get a better view. Niara was there wearing a formal garment that looked like a flowing robe in deep blue, and she ran to Laura as soon as she spotted her. The child chattered excitedly in the Kalari language, and the translator struggled to keep up with the rapid fire. Questions about where Laura lived and what her home among the stars looked like and whether there were children, there and 100 other topics. Kalen appeared and gently reminded Niara to give their guests space to breathe. He gestured for the humans to follow him to where the feast had been prepared. Long, low tables had been set up in the plaza, arranged in a horseshoe pattern with cushions for seating. The center of the horseshoe faced a raised platform where Kalen and the clan elders would sit along with the honored guests. The tables were already laden with food, and the variety was stunning. There were platters of what looked like roasted vegetables in colors that did not exist on Earth, bowls of grain similar to rice but with a faint purple tint, and large cuts of meat from various animals that had been prepared in different ways. Kalen invited Shaw and the others to sit beside him on the raised platform and began the formal introductions. There were 5 elders in addition to Kalen, and each held a specific role in clan governance. There was Marin, who oversaw agriculture and food production, an elderly female with silver markings across her bronze skin. There was Torin, who managed crafts and construction, and who seemed particularly interested in the materials of the humans' clothing and equipment. There was Celine, who served as the primary healer, and who looked at Laura with intense professional interest. There was Dax, who was responsible for education and the preservation of knowledge, and who immediately began asking Hughes about human history and culture. And there was Varix, who oversaw trade and relations with other clans and who wanted to know everything about Earth's economic systems. Before the feast could begin, Kalen stood and raised his cup, which was filled with some kind of amber liquid. He spoke in a voice that carried across the entire plaza, and the translator rendered his words clearly. He welcomed the Sky People to the Red Valley clan and thanked them for the gift they had given by saving young Niara. He said that this feast was a small token of gratitude, but that the clan's true thanks would be shown through friendship and cooperation in the days to come. He declared that the Sky People were under the protection of the clan, and that any Kalari who harmed them would answer to the warriors. Then he drank from his cup, and everyone in the plaza followed suit, including the humans, though Laura noticed Shaw took only a small sip until his scanner could analyze the contents. The feast began, and it was unlike anything Laura had experienced. Kalen explained each dish as it was served, and the variety was incredible. There were protein-rich tubers that had been cultivated in the deep soil and had a texture like potatoes but a flavor that was nutty and slightly sweet. There were fruits that looked like clusters of small bubbles and tasted like honey mixed with something electric and tingling. There were strips of meat from the 6-legged deer creatures that the Kalari called falara, and that had been marinated in herbs and grilled over an open flame. There were grain dishes mixed with local vegetables and spices that created flavors Laura could not compare to anything from Earth. Her medical scanner cleared each item before she tried it, and she found herself genuinely enjoying the exotic meal. Between courses, Kalen shared stories about his people and their history. He explained that the Red Valley clan was one of 7 major clans in this region, and that each clan had its own territory and traditions, but they all shared a common language and cultural heritage. He said that the clans had been at peace for 3 generations, though there were occasional disputes over resources or territory that required negotiation. He talked about the thornback beast that had injured Niara and explained that they were dangerous predators that had been growing more aggressive in recent years, possibly due to changes in their natural prey populations. He described the seasonal patterns of their world and how the clans adapted their activities to match the cycle of the twin suns. Hughes was recording everything and asking careful questions about social structures and governance. He learned that the Kalari had a complex system of leadership where military matters were handled by warriors like Kalen, while civilian affairs were managed by councils of elders. Decisions that affected the entire clan required consensus among the warriors and elders, and major decisions that affected multiple clans required gathering of representatives from all involved parties. It was a system that seemed to balance the need for quick action in emergencies with the desire for thoughtful deliberation on long-term issues. Wright was talking with Torin about construction, and she was amazed to learn that the Kalari grew their buildings from genetically engineered plants. Torin explained that their ancestors had developed these plants over many generations by selecting for desirable traits like structural strength and bioluminescence. The buildings were alive and could repair minor damage on their own, though major repairs required intervention from specialists who understood how to guide the growth patterns. Wright wanted to know if the same techniques could be applied to spacecraft construction, and Torin seemed intrigued by the idea, though he admitted he knew nothing about what challenges space travel might present. Crawford had relaxed somewhat and was engaged in conversation with several of the younger warriors about combat training and tactics. He learned that Kalari warriors trained from adolescence and that their fighting style emphasized agility and precision rather than brute force. The crystalline spears they carried were family heirlooms passed down through generations and were said to never lose their edge. The warriors seemed impressed when Crawford described some of humanity's martial traditions, and there was discussion of possibly arranging a friendly sparring session where both species could learn from each other. Laura found herself sitting with Niara and Selene the healer. Niara was still full of questions about Earth, and Laura tried to answer them in ways a child could understand. She described oceans and mountains and cities full of people, and Niara listened with wide eyes and endless fascination. The days following the feast settled into a pattern that surprised everyone on the research team. What had started as a mission of distant observation transformed into genuine cultural exchange and cooperation. Kalen and his warriors made good on their promise of protection by assigning escorts to any team members who wanted to conduct surveys in the surrounding territory. The warriors knew the land intimately and could point out dangerous plants or animals that the humans would have missed. They also seemed genuinely curious about human technology and methods, and the escorts often turned into informal teaching sessions where both species learned from each other. Shaw had relaxed his strict protocols somewhat, though he still maintained clear guidelines about what information could be shared and what needed to remain confidential for security reasons. He approved regular visits to the settlement for those team members who wanted to learn more about Kalari culture, and he established a schedule of reciprocal visits where small groups of Kalari could tour the outpost and see human technology. Hughes was in his element, documenting everything from family structures to religious beliefs to artistic traditions, and he filed detailed reports every evening that would keep anthropologists on Earth busy for years. Laura found herself spending more time in the settlement than at the outpost. Selene had invited her to work in the healing house where Kalari medical practitioners cared for the sick and injured. The building was one of the larger structures in the settlement, with multiple rooms for different types of treatment and a garden full of medicinal plants. Selene introduced Laura to the other healers, and they were eager to share their knowledge while learning about human medicine in return. Laura demonstrated how her scanner could identify infections and analyze blood chemistry, while the Kalari healers showed her their sophisticated understanding of local herbs and the mysterious energy healing techniques they used. The energy healing was particularly fascinating because it seemed to work even though Laura could not explain the mechanism. She watched as a healer named Corin placed his hands on a patient with a broken bone and somehow accelerated the healing process. Her scanner showed increased cellular activity and rapid bone regeneration but could not identify any external energy source. When she asked Corin to explain, he said it was something all Kalari could do to some degree, though healers trained for years to develop the skill fully. He said it involved channeling what he called life energy from the world around them and directing it into the patient's body. Laura recorded everything and sent detailed notes back to the outpost, knowing that the medical implications could be revolutionary if humans could learn to replicate the technique. One evening, about 2 weeks after the feast, Kalen invited Laura to walk with him through the settlement gardens. The twin suns were setting and painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, while the plants around them began their nightly glow. Kalen was quiet for a while as they walked, and Laura had learned that the Kalari valued silence as much as conversation. Finally he spoke, and his voice was thoughtful. He said that he needed to tell her something important, and that it was not an easy story to share. He began by explaining what had happened on the day Niara returned to the settlement. She had arrived just as the search parties were preparing to go into the forest, and she was walking normally despite the serious injury she had sustained. The healers examined her and found the wound almost completely healed, with strange material wrapped around her leg. Niara told them about the sky visitor who had found her and used magic tools to stop the bleeding and repair the damage. She described Laura's appearance and her gentle manner and how she had given Niara food and water before sending her home. Kaylin said that the settlement erupted into chaos after hearing this story. Some people were amazed and grateful that a stranger had saved one of their children, but others were terrified and angry, believing that Niara had been contaminated or cursed by alien magic. There was a faction led by a warrior named Torak, who wanted to attack the human outpost immediately and drive the sky people away before they could corrupt more children. Another group led by an elder named Vesa wanted to flee into the deep valleys and hide from the strange visitors. The council met in emergency session and debated through the night, while Niara was kept under observation in the healing house. Kaylin said that he had spoken in favor of caution and observation. He pointed out that if the sky people had wanted to harm them, they could have done so easily with their advanced technology. He said that Laura had returned Niara unharmed and had actually saved her life, which suggested peaceful intentions. But Torak argued that the sky people might be trying to win their trust before revealing hostile plans. The debate went in circles and seemed deadlocked, until Niara herself intervened. In a way that no one expected, the child had escaped from the healing house and walked into the council chamber still wearing the bandage Laura had applied. She stood before the assembled elders and warriors and spoke with a clarity that surprised everyone given her young age. She said that Laura could have left her to die alone in the forest but had chosen to help instead. She said that Laura's hands had been gentle and her eyes had been kind. She said that if beings from the stars could show such compassion, then perhaps the stars themselves were not cold and distant places. She said that she wanted to live in a world where kindness was met with gratitude rather than fear and suspicion. Kaylin said that Niara's speech changed everything. The elders were moved by her words, and even Torak seemed affected, though he remained skeptical. They decided to observe the human outpost carefully and to send warriors in the morning to determine the sky people's true intentions. Kaylin had volunteered to lead the delegation because Niara was his granddaughter, and he felt responsible for the situation. He chose 40 warriors, including some who supported him, and some who sided with Torak because he wanted multiple perspectives represented. The plan was to approach peacefully but to be prepared for any response. Laura listened to this story with growing understanding of how close they had come to disaster. She asked Kaylin what had convinced him that humans were truly peaceful. He smiled and said it was the way the humans had come down from their outpost that morning. He said Shaw could have stayed behind fortifications or brought weapons, but instead he came with a small unarmed group to meet 40 armed warriors. He said that took a kind of courage that only came from genuine, peaceful intent, because anyone planning violence would have taken more precautions. Kaylin paused beside a flowering plant that released a sweet fragrance into the evening air. He said that he had spent his entire life as a warrior protecting his people from threats both real and imagined. He had fought against predators and rival clans and natural disasters, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this, where the greatest threat might have been his own fear and prejudice. He said that Laura had done more than save his granddaughter's life. She had shown him that the universe was larger and stranger, and potentially more wonderful than he had ever imagined. She had taught him that different did not automatically mean dangerous, and that compassion could bridge gaps between species that had never even known of each other's existence. Laura felt tears threatening, and she blinked them back. She said that she had been terrified that her actions would cause problems, and that she had violated protocols that existed for good reasons. She said that she had acted on instinct without thinking through the consequences. Kaylin shook his head and said that sometimes instinct was wiser than careful planning. He said that if she had stopped to think about all the possible complications, she might have walked away from Niara, and that would have been the greater tragedy. He said that rules and protocols had their place, but they should serve life rather than restrict it. They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer as the last light faded from the sky and the bioluminescent plants provided illumination. Laura thought about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The research team had gained unprecedented access to an alien culture and had established friendly relations that would benefit both species. She had made friends among the Kalari, including Niara, who followed her around like a curious shadow whenever she visited the settlement. She had learned healing techniques that challenged everything she thought she knew about medicine, and she had discovered that the fundamental values of compassion and kindness that drove her work on Earth applied equally well on worlds countless light years away. When they returned to the central plaza, Kalen thanked her for listening to his story. He said that he had wanted her to understand how significant her actions had been, and how they had affected not just one family, but the entire clan's relationship with humanity. He said that there would always be people like Torak who viewed strangers with suspicion, but that Niara's generation would grow up knowing that the universe contained friends as well as dangers. Laura thanked him for his honesty and for giving humanity a chance to prove themselves worthy of the Kalari's trust. Laura walked back to the outpost, that night accompanied by her usual warrior escort. She reflected on the conversation. She understood now that first contact was not just about following protocols and avoiding. The next month brought changes that transformed both the human outpost and the Kalari settlement in ways that neither side had anticipated. Shaw established formal exchange programs where team members could spend extended time living in the settlement, while selected Kalari could stay at the outpost to learn about human technology and culture. The first Kalari resident was Dax, the education elder, who moved into a spare quarters module and spent his days asking endless questions about everything from human history to the principles of space travel. He was particularly fascinated by the concept of writing and the human's ability to store vast amounts of information in electronic formats. The Kalari had their own written language, but it was used primarily for formal records and ceremonies, while most knowledge was passed down through oral tradition. Hughes worked with Dax to create a comprehensive cultural exchange curriculum. They started with basic language lessons going both ways because, while the translation devices were useful, they could not capture the full nuance and poetry of either language. Laura found herself attending evening classes in the Kalari language, along with several other team members, and she discovered that the clicking melodic sounds were easier to produce than she expected once she understood the rhythm. The Kalari who were learning English struggled more with certain consonants, but they approached the challenge with enthusiasm and humor. There were many moments of laughter when someone from either species mangled a word or accidentally created an unintended meaning. The medical exchange proved especially fruitful. Celine began spending several days each week at the outpost where Laura showed her human diagnostic equipment and explained the principles behind various treatments. Celine was amazed by the scanner's ability to see inside a body without cutting it open, and she immediately understood the medical applications. She asked if such devices could be made to work with Kalari physiology, and Laura worked with the team's engineer to modify one of the backup scanners. The results were not perfect because Kalari biology had some differences that the software was not designed to handle, but they managed to create a functional tool that Celine could use in the healing house. In return, Laura spent more time learning the Kalari energy healing techniques. Celine explained that the ability was something all Kalari possessed to varying degrees, because it was connected to their relationship with the living world around them. She said that humans might be able to learn it, but it would require developing senses that seemed to be dormant in their species. Laura was skeptical but willing to try, and Celine began teaching her meditation techniques that were supposed to help her become aware of the energy flows that the Kalari perceived naturally. After 2 weeks of practice, Laura still could not sense anything unusual, but Celine remained patient and encouraging. One afternoon, while Laura was working in the healing house, a young Kalari male was brought in with a severe infection in his arm. He had cut himself on a piece of metal several days earlier, and had not sought treatment until the wound began to swell and darken. Celine examined him, and her expression was grave. She said the infection had spread into the bloodstream and was beyond what their normal treatments could handle quickly enough. The patient was feverish and delirious, and his family stood by looking terrified. Laura scanned the wound and confirmed that the infection was aggressive and potentially fatal if not treated immediately. She had broad-spectrum antibiotics in her medical kit, but she hesitated because introducing human medicine into the general Kalari population raised questions that had not been fully addressed. Celine saw her hesitation and understood the dilemma. She said that the young male's name was Riven, and he was a craftsman who had only recently completed his training. She said that his family had given permission for any treatment that might save his life, including sky visitor medicine if necessary. Laura made her decision and administered a strong dose of antibiotics along with anti-inflammatory medication to bring down the fever. She cleaned and dressed the wound properly and then showed Celine exactly what she had done so the Kalari healer could monitor the patient's progress. Over the next several hours, they took turns watching Riven as the medication began to work. His fever broke around sunset and his breathing became easier. By the time the twin suns rose the next morning, he was awake and asking for water. His family wept with relief and gratitude, and Celine looked at Laura with something like awe. Word of Riven's recovery spread. Through the settlement and more, Kalari began coming to the healing house, specifically to see Laura. Some had injuries or illnesses that they wanted her to examine. Others were simply curious about the sky visitor who could work healing miracles. Laura found herself conducting informal clinics several times a week, always with Celine or another Kalari healer present. She was careful to explain what she was doing and why, and she always deferred to the Kalari healers on questions of cultural appropriateness or traditional treatments. The collaboration worked well, and Laura began to understand the Kalari medical system from the inside. Meanwhile, Wright and Torin had developed an unexpected friendship based on their shared interest in engineering and construction. Wright showed Torin the principles behind the human spacecraft and explained how the various systems work together to enable interstellar travel. Torin was fascinated by the concept of manipulating gravity and asked detailed questions about the mathematics involved. In return, he taught Wright about the Kalari's biological engineering and how they had developed plants that could serve structural purposes. Wright began to see possibilities for combining both approaches, and she spent her evenings sketching designs for hybrid structures that used both grown components and traditional manufactured materials. Crawford's relationship with the warriors had evolved from cautious, professional respect to genuine camaraderie. He had participated in several training sessions where he demonstrated human martial arts and learned Kalari combat techniques in return. The warriors were impressed by certain aspects of human fighting styles, particularly the emphasis on using an opponent's momentum against them. Crawford was equally impressed by the Kalari's speed and agility, which came from their longer limbs and different muscle structure. He proposed organizing a friendly tournament where warriors from both species could compete in non-lethal contests, and Kalen approved the idea enthusiastically. The tournament took place on a warm afternoon in the plaza with most of the settlement gathered to watch. There were contests of speed and accuracy and strength and endurance. The Kalari won most of the speed events because they could move faster over short distances. The humans won most of the strength events because their more compact muscle structure gave them advantages in direct force application. The accuracy contests were split with both sides showing impressive skill with their respective weapons. The whole event had a festival atmosphere with food and music, and lots of good-natured cheering for both sides. During a break in the competitions, Niara found Laura in the crowd and pulled her aside with obvious excitement. The child said she had something important to show her and led her to one of the smaller buildings near the edge of the settlement. Inside was what appeared to be a workshop with tables covered in various projects. Niara pointed proudly to a small carved figure that sat on one table. It was clearly meant to represent Laura with the characteristic human proportions, and even a miniature version of her medical kit. The carving was remarkably detailed for someone of Niara's age, and Laura felt touched by the gesture. Niara explained that she was learning the craft of sculpture from her uncle and that she wanted to make something to honor the person who had saved her life. She asked if Laura liked it, and Laura assured her that she loved it and would treasure it always. Niara beamed with pride, and then showed Laura several other projects she was working on, including carvings of other human team members. The child said she wanted to create a record of this time when the Sky People first came to their world, so that future generations would remember. Laura felt a lump in her throat as she realized that they were not just making first contact, but were becoming part of Kalari history and culture in a permanent way. That evening, Shaw called a team meeting to discuss the progress they had made and to address some concerns that had been raised. He acknowledged that the mission had evolved far beyond its original parameters, and that the level of cultural integration they had achieved was unprecedented in human history. He said that Earth Command was pleased with the results but also cautious about the pace of change. There were questions about whether they were moving too fast and whether the Kalari society could absorb human influences without suffering. disruption to their traditional ways. Hughes reported on his observations and said that the Kalari seemed to be adapting well to the exchange. He noted that their culture had always valued knowledge and learning, so the introduction of new ideas was consistent with their existing values. He said there were some tensions, particularly among older Kalari, who worried about traditional practices being forgotten, but that overall the response was positive. He recommended continuing the current approach while remaining sensitive to concerns about cultural preservation. 6 months after Laura had helped the limping child in the forest, the research outpost had transformed into something that resembled a small embassy more than a scientific station. The Council of Clans had taken place 3 months earlier, and representatives from all 7 regional clans had attended to meet the sky visitors and evaluate whether they wished to establish contact. The gathering had lasted for 5 days and had included demonstrations of technology, exchanges of cultural knowledge, medical consultations, and lengthy discussions about the future relationship between humans and Kalari. By the end, 5 of the 7 clans had voted to establish friendly relations, while the remaining 2 had chosen to maintain their distance and observe from afar, which everyone agreed was a reasonable position. The most significant development had been the decision by Earth Command to establish a permanent diplomatic presence on Kepler 442b. A larger ship was already en route carrying additional personnel, including trained diplomats, more scientists, cultural specialists, and the equipment needed to build a proper embassy facility. Shaw would return to Earth with most of the original research team, but several members, including Laura, had requested and been granted permission to stay on as part of the permanent mission. The news had been met with celebration in the Red Valley settlement, where the Kalari had grown fond of their human neighbors and were pleased that the relationship would continue. Laura stood on the hillside where the outpost had first been established and watched the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. She had spent countless evenings in this spot over the past months, watching the settlement below and thinking about how much had changed. The scared woman who had stepped off the landing craft 6 months ago had been transformed by her experiences here. She had learned a new language and studied an alien medical system. She had made genuine friends among people who looked nothing like her, but who shared her fundamental values. She had witnessed the birth of a relationship between 2 civilizations that would shape the future of both species for generations to come. Niara appeared on the path below, climbing up to join her with the boundless energy that children everywhere seemed to possess. The young Kalari had grown noticeably taller in the past months and had lost some of the awkwardness of early childhood. The wound on her leg had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar that she wore with pride as a reminder of the day she met her first sky visitor. She reached the top of the hill and stood beside Laura, looking out at the settlement as the lights began to glow in the gathering darkness. Nira asked Laura if she was sad, that some of her friends would be leaving soon, and Laura admitted that she was. She said that Shaw and Crawford and Wright and the others had become like family during the long journey from Earth and the months of working together here, but she also said that she was excited about staying and continuing the work they had started. She said that there was still so much to learn and so many ways that humans and Kalari could help each other. Niara nodded seriously and said that she was glad Laura was staying because she still had many questions about Earth and the stars, and she did not want to lose her teacher. They sat together on the hillside, and Niara talked about her plans for the future. She said that she wanted to become a healer like Celine and like Laura. She said that she wanted to learn everything about both Kalari and human medicine so that she could help people using the best techniques from both traditions. She said that her grandfather, Kalen, supported this plan and had already spoken to Celine about beginning Niara's formal training, even though she was younger than apprentices usually started. Celine had agreed because she recognized that Niara had the intelligence and dedication needed to become an excellent healer. Laura felt a wave of emotion at the thought that her actions 6 months ago had not only saved this child's life but had inspired her to pursue a path of healing. She told Niara that she would be honored to teach her everything she knew, and that she had no doubt Niara would become a skilled and compassionate healer. Niara beamed with happiness and then pulled out a small package wrapped in woven fabric. She said she had made something for Laura and wanted to give it to her before the big farewell ceremony that was planned for the next day. Laura unwrapped the package carefully and found a carved pendant on a braided cord. The pendant was made from some kind of polished stone that caught the fading light and showed swirls of color. Carved into the stone was a figure that clearly represented Laura, along with a smaller figure that was obviously Niara. Around them were symbols that Laura recognized from her language, studies as representing healing, friendship, and gratitude. The craftsmanship was remarkable, especially considering Niara's age, and Laura felt tears sting her eyes as she realized how much thought and care had gone into creating this gift. She thanked Niara and put the pendant on immediately. She said that she would treasure it always, and that it would remind her of why she had chosen to become a healer in the first place. She said that meeting Niara had been one of the most important moments of her life, and that she was grateful for the opportunity to watch her grow and learn. Niara hugged her tightly and then ran back down the hill to help with preparations for the next day's ceremony, her energy undiminished despite the late hour. The farewell ceremony was held in the plaza with hundreds of Kalari gathered to honor the departing humans and to celebrate the friendship that had been forged between their peoples. Representatives from all 7 clans attended, including Torak from the Western Ridge, who had become an unexpected advocate for continued cultural exchange. The plaza was decorated with banners and garlands made from local flowers, and the air was filled with the sounds of Kalari music. Tables had been set up with food from both cultures, and the smell of cooking filled the warm afternoon air. Kalen spoke first, as was his right as leader of the host clan. He stood on the raised platform where the first feast had been held, and his voice carried across the gathered crowd. He spoke of the day 6 months ago when 40 warriors had knelt before the human outpost to pledge their protection and gratitude. He said that what had begun as a response to one act of kindness had grown into a friendship that enriched both peoples. He thanked Shaw for his leadership and his willingness to take risks in the name of peace. He thanked Crawford for sharing warrior knowledge and for treating Kalari fighters with respect. He thanked Wright for her engineering insights that were already being incorporated into new building designs. He thanked Hughes for his careful documentation of Kalari culture and for his genuine interest in preserving their traditions, even as both societies changed. Then Kalen turned to Laura, and his voice softened. He said that she had shown his people that beings from distant stars could possess the same compassion and courage that the Kalari valued in their own heroes. He said that she had not only saved his granddaughter, but had opened a door to friendship that might otherwise have remained closed by fear and suspicion. He said that the name Laura Bennett would be remembered in clan histories for generations, and that children not yet born would hear the story of the sky healer who helped a limping child and changed the course of 2 civilizations. He presented her with a ceremonial spear that had belonged to his father, an honor that brought gasps from the assembled Kalari because such weapons were rarely given to anyone outside the immediate family. Shaw responded with equal formality, thanking the Kalari for their hospitality and their willingness to embrace contact with an alien species. He said that humanity had dreamed of finding other intelligent life for centuries, and that the Kalari had exceeded all hopes and expectations. He said that the relationships built here would serve as a model for future human contact with other species, and that the lessons learned would guide humanity's expansion into the galaxy. He promised that the humans who remained and those who would arrive in the future would continue to honor the trust that the Kalari had placed in them. He presented Kalen with a gift from Earth, a crystal sphere that contained images and sounds from humanity's homeworld along with greetings from Earth's leaders. Ceremony continued with music and dancing and the exchange of many smaller gifts between individuals who had formed friendships during the past months. Crawford sparred one final time with his favorite Kalari training partner, to the cheers of warriors from both species. Wright showed Torin her final designs for hybrid structures that combined biological and manufactured components. Hughes presented Dax with copies of all the cultural documentation they had compiled, along with equipment that would allow the Kalari to continue recording their own history. Celine gave Laura a collection of medicinal plants along with detailed instructions for their cultivation and use, a gift that represented years of accumulated knowledge being passed from one healer to another. As the twin suns began to set and the bioluminescent plants started their evening glow, Laura found herself standing with Shaw and the others who would be departing. The landing craft that would take them back to the main ship was already powered up and waiting. Shaw looked at Laura and asked one final time if she was certain about staying. He said that she had already accomplished more than anyone could have expected and that the silence in the observation deck was absolute for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Shaw broke it first by clearing his throat and turning to face the assembled team. His expression had shifted from alarm to cautious calculation, and Laura could see him running through scenarios in his mind the way he always did before making important decisions. He looked at Crawford and then at Hughes and finally at Laura before speaking. He said they needed to respond and that waiting would be interpreted as either fear or disrespect, depending on the cultural context. He said that a small delegation would go down to meet the warriors, but they would go unarmed except for translators and communication devices. Crawford immediately protested and said that sending people down there without weapons was asking for trouble. Shaw cut him off with a sharp gesture and reminded him that 40 warriors could easily overrun their outpost, regardless of what small arms they might carry for defense. He said their only real protection was the possibility of peaceful intentions, and that showing up armed might turn a friendly encounter into a hostile one. Hughes agreed and added that in most warrior cultures, the act of kneeling was a sign of respect or submission, and that responding with weapons would be an insult. Crawford did not look happy, but he nodded his acceptance. Shaw then announced who would be going down. He would lead the delegation because that was his responsibility as mission commander. Crawford would accompany them because security was his job, even if he had to do it without a gun. Hughes would come because they needed someone who understood cultural dynamics and could spot potential misunderstandings before they escalated. And Laura would go because this situation existed because of her actions, and because she was the only one who had actually interacted with the natives. He asked if there were any objections, and when no one spoke, he told the rest of the team to remain on high alert and to be ready to seal the outpost if things went wrong. The four of them gathered in the airlock and ran through final equipment checks. Laura's hands were steady now, and she felt a strange calm settling over her, the way it always did when she was about to walk into an emergency room. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it directly and deal with the consequences of her choice to help that child. Shaw gave her a long look and then nodded as if he understood what she was feeling. They cycled through the airlock and stepped out onto the hillside. The walk down to where the warriors waited was surreal. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of the crystalline trees and something else that might have been incense or ceremonial smoke. The two suns were climbing the sky and casting long shadows across the red soil. Laura could feel 40 pairs of eyes watching their descent, and she kept her posture straight and her movements smooth. Crawford walked slightly behind and to the left in a protective position even without his weapon. Hughes was muttering into his recorder, noting details about the warriors' formation and appearance. Shaw led them with the confidence of someone who had commanded dangerous situations before. As they got closer, Laura could see more details of the warriors and the older leader. The Kalari were even more impressive up close with their bronze skin, marked by patterns that might have been tattoos or possibly some kind of natural coloring that developed with age. Their eyes were large and reflective, and they watched the approaching humans with intense focus, but no apparent hostility. The spears they carried were works of art with shafts carved from dark wood and tips made from some kind of crystal that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. The ceremonial armor was made from overlapping plates of leather and metal that would provide good protection while allowing freedom of movement. The older warrior remained kneeling until Shaw and the others were about 10 meters away, and then he rose smoothly to his feet. He was tall, perhaps 2.5 meters, and his bearing spoke of decades of combat experience and command. The child ran to him and spoke rapidly in the clicking melodic language of the Kalari, and the translator devices struggled to keep up with the torrent of words. Laura caught fragments about sky visitors and healing touch and gratitude beyond measure. The warrior placed one large hand on the child's shoulder and spoke to them in a quieter tone that the translators rendered as something like, "Be calm, little one, and let me speak to the star people properly." Then the warrior turned his full attention to the human delegation and placed his hand over his heart before extending it toward them, palm up. Hughes immediately whispered that this was a gesture of profound respect in many cultures, and that they should mirror it slowly and carefully. Shaw did so, and Laura and Crawford followed his example. The warrior's fierce expression softened into something that might have been a smile, though. His face was so different from a human's that it was hard to be certain. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, and the translator rendered his words with impressive accuracy. He introduced himself as Kalen of the Red Valley clan and leader of the warrior society that protected the settlement and the surrounding territory. He said that the child was his granddaughter and her name was Niara. He said that she had been attacked by a thornback beast while gathering herbs in the forest 2 days ago and that the creature's claws carried a poison that would have killed her by nightfall. He said that their healers had been searching for her when she returned to the settlement, walking on her injured leg and telling impossible stories about a healer from beyond the stars. Shaw introduced their delegation and explained that they had come from a world called Earth to learn about the Kalari and their civilization. He apologized if Laura's actions had caused any offense or violated any customs, and said that she had acted from instinct rather than any desire to interfere. Kalen raised one hand to stop him and shook his head. He said that there was no offense and no violation. He said that Laura had seen a child in need and had offered help without knowing anything about their people or their ways. He said that such kindness from a stranger was the rarest and most valuable gift that anyone could give. He raised his spear and struck it against the ground 3 times, and the sound echoed across the valley again. He spoke in a voice that carried to all the assembled warriors and probably to the settlement beyond. The translator worked to keep up, but the meaning came through clearly. Kalen was announcing that the Sky People, and especially the healer Laura, had shown themselves to be beings of honor and compassion. He declared that the warriors of the Red Valley clan would pledge their protection to the visitors for as long as they remained in these lands. He said that any who threatened the Sky People would be treated as enemies of the clan and dealt with accordingly. He said that Laura would be considered as kin, a member of the family, and that the debt of a saved life could never be fully repaid but would be honored in every way possible. The 40 warriors rose as one and struck their spears against the ground in unison, creating a sound like thunder rolling across the landscape. They shouted something in their own language that the translator rendered as a formal acceptance of the pledge. Laura felt tears stinging her eyes, though she was not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was relief that her actions had not caused disaster, or perhaps it was the overwhelming realization that compassion really could bridge the gap between species. Shaw looked stunned, and even Crawford seemed moved by the ceremony. Kalen approached Laura directly and looked down at her from his considerable height. He spoke more quietly now so that only their small group could hear. He said that Niara was the last of his bloodline, the only grandchild from his eldest son who had died hunting the same kind of thornback beast that attacked her. He said that if she had died, his family line would have ended, and the knowledge and traditions he carried would have had no one to pass to. He said that Laura had given him not just his granddaughter, but his future and his legacy. He asked what he could possibly offer in return that would be worthy of such a gift. Laura found her voice and spoke carefully. She said that seeing Niara healthy and happy was payment enough. She said that where she came from, healers took an oath to help anyone in need regardless of who they were or where they came from. She said that she had only done what her training and her conscience demanded, and that she hoped any healer among his people would do the same for a human child in trouble. Kalen studied her for a long moment and then nodded slowly. He said that their healers would indeed help any child they found regardless of origin, but that he suspected not all species in the universe shared that value. He said that knowing humans did share it made him hopeful for the future of both their peoples. He then invited Shaw and the entire human delegation to a feast that evening. He said it was the least they could do to welcome honored guests and new kin to their lands. Shaw accepted the invitation with appropriate formality, though Laura could see the excitement in his eyes. Hughes was practically vibrating with eagerness at the chance to observe Kalari customs firsthand. Even Crawford seemed intrigued despite his earlier skepticism. Kalen gave instructions to several of his warriors who nodded and departed at a run, presumably to begin preparations. He told the humans that they should return to their outpost to rest and that warriors would come to escort.